What do you make of this economy right now?
Economy's in really good shape.
Yeah, is that surprising to you?
No. I think there's good positive momentum in the economy. The labor report today, obviously, with job creation, participation rate, average hourly earnings, and new entrants into the labor force. It's a terrific report, supports good momentum in the economy, and I think people should focus a little bit more on the real economy and a little bit less on whether the Fed cuts in May, June, or July.
So the market reaction then doesn't surprise you?
Not at all. I think the market, is focused on, and should be focused on, what's going on in the real economy and how does that affect corporate earnings. If you look at the Fed policy, there's certainly a bias that the next move will be a cut, 80-20, 90-10 in that direction. But whether it's 2 or 3 this year is really not going to have a material effect on where the stock market ends up at the end of the year.
But when it comes to the real economy, Ralph, what are we talking about here? I mean, we can look at spending trends, even divorced from whatever the Fed is doing or whatever the markets are doing. And we've seen certain pockets of folks out there who have either pulled back on spending or at least tried to find maybe cheaper alternatives to what they would normally spend on. Has that not reached a critical mass that causes you any concern?
Well, we have a serious problem in this country, which is continuing to happen, which is a widening of both the wealth gap, particularly, and the income gap as well. And so, for example, when we talk about the tail of the stimulus that was put in place for the pandemic, people talk about, there's still $1 trillion of stimulus that hasn't been spent. Mm-hmm. That $1 trillion is concentrated in the upper income brackets. Mm-hmm. Everybody in middle class and below has already exhausted their pandemic stimulus. Mm-hmm. So there's a real gap that continues to widen in this country.
How do you close that gap? Is this all about policies coming out of Washington, or is there something else we can do?
Well, a strong economy, mm-hmm. Both in the latter half of before the pandemic and in the Biden administration, narrows the gap earnings between lower and middle income people and upper income people. I'm a very small minority in the community in which I live, but I happen to think capital gains taxes should be the same as ordinary income taxes. Yeah. I've never met someone who didn't invest because they were worried about the tax rate. I don't think capital formation would be any less if we had a capital gains rate. And if you look back historically, that's been a major factor in the widening of the wealth gap. Why is it that my max federal tax rate on capital that I'm investing is 20%, mm-hmm. and the average worker is 37%. Yeah. Does that make any sense? I don't think so.
It really doesn't. You spend a lot of time in the UK too.
I do. Half my time.
Your other half might have a job there. But is it the same over there too in terms of the issues with the wealth gap and the issues that then we create in the economy, or is there something unique about the U.S. in either way?
Well, the United States, and this is a great plus, and it's been a fuel for growth of our economy. The remarkable thing is, if you looked at the United States and Europe in 2000, our economies were roughly the same size. Right. Ours is now 50 to 60% larger than that of Europe. I was listening to something this morning, and they pointed out that if the UK were a state in the United States, it would be the poorest state in the country, with a per capita income about $1,000 below Mississippi.
Wow.
So what we're doing here is working in aggregate. It's just not being distributed as well as it could. And if you look at federal taxes as a percentage of GDP, they're down about 3 or 4% versus where they were 15 years ago.
But who's going to run on a platform of raising taxes?
Nobody.
Exactly.
Nobody.
President Biden.
No, well, he is, yes,
Well,
but unfortunately.
But even that, he kind of confines it to, the wealthy or the super rich or something. I mean, no one's really bold enough to talk about a broad-based tax increase, are they?
Well, eventually, we have an unsustainable fiscal situation in our country right now. I'm not saying that it's going to end this year, next year, the year after, but something will happen, and then all of a sudden people will say, wow, this is a real problem, we got to fix it, and then there'll be some combination of tax and spending adjustments similar to what Simpson and Bowles put together.
But it does feel, though, that the boogeyman that we then like to talk about is China in relation, that like them dumping a lot of stuff into the U.S. is causing lost jobs, and we tend to make them the bad guy in a lot of situations. Where is that true and where is that not true? With Secretary Yellen over there in China right now, I'm wondering what the right policy should be.
Well, first of all, you have to recognize that China has changed a lot over the last 10 or 12 years. 12 years ago, China was moving closer to the rule of law in their own country. They were making decisions about attracting investment and making it very commodious for non-Chinese to invest and build factories there. Their politics has changed. They've subverted rule of law and economics to security and Taiwan and other national security issues. What we're doing is, I think, a pretty appropriate reaction to the way they have adjusted. And, they've made economics, freer trade and a commodious relationship between the U.S. and China, the two largest economies in the world, is really in everybody's interest. Mm-hmm. But if both sides are sitting there thinking about how does this affect my security and safety rather than my pocketbook, decisions are going to be made that are not going to be totally supportive of global growth.
What's your biggest worry right now? There's a lot happening.
Well, I think the biggest worry is this is the most uncertain time I can remember in my 45 years in finance. And
you worked in government, too.
And 7 years in government before that. When you consider what's the general path of the economy? What's our fiscal policy how is that going to affect us over the intermediate to longer term? We have two really hot wars underway right now. There's a hopefully moderating a little bit, but a contentious relationship between the two largest economic powers and probably the two largest military powers as well. So there's a lot to be worried about, and hopefully they don't happen.
Do you have any hope, though, that some of this might get resolved in the short term? I mean, we've had a big election here in the U.S., not just for president, but something that could potentially reshape Congress and obviously our policies toward the rest of the world.
The upsetting thing, I think, is that there are very few things that you can get Democrats and Republicans to agree on. Bashing China is one of them. Yeah. There is nobody running for Congress, Senate, or for House, the Senate, or President who's going to stand up and say, we need rapprochement between the U.S. and China. Look how the TikTok bill went through the House and, will probably pass the Senate as well. So I think the general trend is, I think President Biden is a globalist. I think he's done a lot to.
Isn't that a dirty word these days, though?
Well, you wouldn't want to go on a campaign stump and talk about that.
Yeah.
But I do spend a fair amount of time in Europe, and there's a fair amount of nervousness about the outcome of our election, to be honest.
All right, Ralph, well, you always have great insights into what's going on here and around the world, and really appreciate you taking time for us.
Thank you very much.